Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Thursday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in, so let's jump in and see what we got. First up on Patreon, BDavs88 wants to know if that upcoming Mr. Clone board is going to support a 5-volt power supply or if you have to use a 12-volt power supply. And I think, just based on what Taki has posted, that if you already have a good quality 5-volt power supply, like maybe you bought a Triad or something like that, it will work. But if you use the 12-volt power supply it's bundled with, that will still work. You just have to use a different adapter cable depending on the I/O board that you use. So this is one of the points that I made, that I really think this is a terrible idea, because if you have an I/O board that interfaces externally, this is fine. But what if you have like a retro castle case that goes on top and that gets its voltage that way? Will that require something different? I have no clue. I'm assuming yes, but maybe that would be the case where, since you power it through the retro castle board, it won't be a problem and you just wouldn't use the power supply bundled with the kit. I don't know, but what happens if you do use the power supply bundled with it, plug it into the retro castle kit, and now you're sending 12 volts into a 5-volt board? So this is why I think all of that is a bad idea. I haven't heard back from Taki at all. I'm not even sure if he saw my messages, to be honest with you, but I do hope that he listens and considers this, because I just think it's going to end in disaster. Now, I would like to be wrong, and I also am really psyched for this project, so I don't know if I haven't heard back because he thinks I'm picking on him or something. I'm not. I'm really fired up for the project. I kind of see where things are going to go wrong, but I like being incorrect when it comes to stuff like this. Maybe he'll ship it with the 12-volt PSU and everything will be flawless, but I don't know. But I guess the honest answer is I have no clue. We have to just kind of wait and see, but it's a very good question. Next up, Steven Sanders says they were jumping around some forums the other day and came across an interesting post regarding the PlayStation 1 early models and the RCA jacks. The poster said that the optimal way to use the console was with a video-only RGB SCART into the multi-out and high-quality RCA for audio, that the RCA was the better way to access that audio capabilities. What are the thoughts on that? So I don't think that's true. There was a whole thing, maybe 15 years ago now, where certain models of the PS1 supposedly had audiophile grade CD audio quality, and I believe it was the models with that RCA jack, and I don't really remember how true that actually was. It is certainly possible that those models had a different audio processor and sounded a little better, but I definitely remember when I was reading those articles, it said it recommended you turn on your PlayStation 1 and let it warm up for a couple of days in order to get this performance. So all of this sounds like audiophile BS to me. I would love to know anybody else's opinions on that, but generally speaking, I personally wouldn't worry about any of that. And audio is very important to me. It depends on the game, of course. You got an Atari 2600 game. I'm not really looking for the optimal audio output because it doesn't have the best audio. But when you're talking about CD quality audio, yes, of course. But I would not put any thought into that. And let me rephrase that. I would love to research this if I had time, just because of my nerdiness. But in my personal setup, I wouldn't put any thought into that. I would plug in a shielded RGB SCART cable or HD Retrovision or whatever else, because that's way more important. If you're using shielded cables versus unshielded cables, that's going to definitely be a much bigger difference, but it should route from all of the same sources. So I don't think that's a real thing, but it's a great question, and if anybody knows, please let me know. And if I'm wrong, I'll correct myself next week and make fun of myself for getting it wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is not something you would have to worry about. Next up, Durf from the Console Mods Wiki said, a while back I recommended a cheap $30 oscilloscope, which has been very useful. However, they'd like one with a persistence mode so they could calibrate disc layers via the eye patterns. Do I know of any good cheap ones that have persistence modes, or should I stop being a cheap ass and buy a proper full-size scope? So I don't know of one. I have two answers as usual. The direct answer to your question is no, I don't know of a cheap one that you could use for that. But my opinion is, if you have a scenario where you're like, I got a ton of arcade boards, I got a super gun that's supposed to be safe, but I just want to double check, that $30 scope is absolutely perfect. Or, basic stuff. Hey, what's the range of my console outputting? It looks a little weird. Even though those little scopes might not be perfectly accurate, or at least the way that you measure them could be a little bit different. So you could be off by a couple of millivolts. It's still going to be way better than guessing. So I love those as like a cheap tool in the toolbox. However, I personally have decided that the moment I've moved on from, let me just plug this thing in real quick, to, okay, I need to actually take real measurements, I would only use that Rigel scope. So I haven't used the cheap scope in a while. I should do that in more live streams, just to get more people even more familiar with it and to show when is the right and wrong time to do it. My personal opinion, that 24-bit IO board stream was not the time to use that. I wanted precision. I wanted down to the millivolt correct. However, there's a ton of other streams where I could have just used that instead. Also, the fact that you actually should use it on battery power, not plugged in because of ground measurement issues, makes it pretty easy. That way you could just keep it charged, batter your charge up fairly quickly, and then you could just walk around with it and you don't need a stationary setup. So I'm going to leave a link to the main oscilloscope page. Anybody could form their own opinions. Those Owan scopes also perform fairly well, and they're kind of a price point in the middle, but it is my opinion, now that I found the cheap one, that you should either get the cheap tool for the toolbox or get the real tool, knowing that you're going to be able to measure and all of that stuff. And remember, there's that wink, wink, nudge, nudge unlock code, which I think this could be complete internet lore and made up. This could all be a lie, not created by me, but I think Rigel isn't really worried about consumers punching in that code to unlock the software features. Because I believe this is a scenario where they found a lot of hobbyists were doing that. And they're probably pissed off at first, like, hey, you just got $700 worth of software upgrades for free. But then they were noticing those home tinkerers are now telling their jobs, hey, we need 5 brand new scopes, buy these with the software unlock. So that money they were losing with the consumers, they're gaining back quite a lot more for companies that are saying, okay, my crew's used to this. Let's get these, let's get the same software. Now, once again, that could be completely false and made up. That could be a total lie to make you feel better for essentially stealing, but I am certainly comfortable saying, go look around for that unlock code to make sure that you can get the most features out of it, because we're not buying 100 of these things to put in a factory. We're trying to tinker, and we're telling more people to buy Rigel scopes. So Rigel, if you want to sue me for telling people to buy your scopes, that's fine. But morally speaking, I'm not worried about this one. But, you all could make your own opinions on that. I will not be posting the unlock code anywhere because I think that's a little bit too far for me. But, anybody with a search engine can find it. So I'll leave a link to that page for you. Next up, Veronica Explains has a RetroTink 5X, which they very much enjoy using on a 1920 by 1080 monitor. They recently came across a flat panel that is 1280 by 1024, which is a 5:4 aspect ratio with DVI and VGA inputs, and their RGB to HDMI modded systems look great on it, as do their VGA PCs. However, the Tink 5X seems to think it's a 720p monitor, so it squishes the image in the middle as if it's 16:9 widescreen. Is there a setting in the firmware that lets you tell the Tink that it's plugged into a 5:4 aspect ratio monitor that could center the image and crop it just like Mister does when you set it to that resolution? Unfortunately not. And in fact, I reached out to Mike and asked when I read your question just to double check, as my guess is correct. The FPGA in the Tink 5X is basically completely filled. So in order to add more resolutions, including ones that don't even really push the Tink past its limits, you would still have to remove an existing resolution in order for that to fit. So unfortunately, that's not a thing that's going to be added to the 5X at all. You might want to look into maybe a GBS control. I'm not sure if that could do that, to be honest with you, but it's worth looking into, and especially somebody like you who doesn't mind tinkering with stuff like that. You might want to just whip up one of those for cheap just to have as a tool in your toolbox. But that's something that I'm pretty sure you can do with the RetroTink 4K. However, with respect to Mike, I would never suggest somebody spend that much money on a Tink 4K just to do this. I'd rather see you spend your money on an OLED monitor or something like that, and and then eventually upgrade. So, just for anybody who's curious, maybe you already have a Tink 4K that you use on a giant 4K OLED, but sometimes you want to use it on something like this. You should be able to just create a custom mode line that does exactly what you need, and then just kind of play with the aspect controls to make sure that the aspect ratio stays at 4:3. However, once again, don't buy that just to use on this monitor. So you might be kind of out of luck for this one. The OSSC might be another good choice for this. I don't remember if it supports that resolution or not, but I know it does have some pretty cool customizations, and it can output 4:3 resolutions, so that you should be able to stretch and center that way. But unfortunately, it's just not something that you could probably accomplish with the Tink 5X. So excellent question, but now the FPGA is filled up to the basically capacity in that, and I'm not sure if we're going to see another firmware update for it just for that reason. Next up, GameCube Fan 74 has been looking for a good DAC to convert HDMI to VGA, and they want to know if I know any of the ones that are going to be released. They called out one seller in a good way, not a bad way, but I actually know of 3 that were in development, and I've heard nothing about any of them. So this is one of those cases where I strongly think you should think about today. And I don't mean any disrespect by that. I just mean when projects like this, which use off-the-shelf parts but require a lot of tinkering to get it right, when these projects happen, they often take a very long time to finally hit the market. And there are good existing solutions out there. So the suggestion I have to you is to check out the post that I did that highlighted Kuro's work a while back. I'll leave a link in the description, obviously, but there are 2 cheap recommended DACs that are only video, not audio. So if you have the ability to output audio separate, if you already have an HDMI audio extractor that's implemented in this, without a doubt buy these, because they're like $10 or less. So you could have a solution right now that's HDMI to VGA that will work perfectly. If you need audio and you want just an amazing solution, the HD Fury 4 is expensive. It's like $300 as opposed to $10, but it'll do everything you need. And I'm pretty sure it's an HDMI splitter on top of all of that. So that's certainly one that if you're just like, I don't want to mess around, I just want something that's absolutely perfect and will work with everything that I need and have some extra features, that's the one to get. So I would do that right now today, just to make sure that you have a solution that works. And then if any of the other sellers come up with a homebrew solution, of course, then I'm going to start recommending that, because I always want to support people in the community, but they're just not out yet. So once again, no shade being thrown, no insults. I'm just being honest. And I always try to remind people that there's always going to be something better coming around the corner. It's technology. I mean, if there wasn't, then it's a dead scene. So you need to decide whether you need something today or whether you need something soon. And if your question was, hey, I already bought that cheap DAC, I have an okay audio solution for now, do you know when these others are coming out? My answer would have been, just wait and see, because you already have a perfectly good solution, but it doesn't sound like you have one. So I would just go with either the cheap one or just drop the cash and get the really good one with the splitter built in, and just know that you have an awesome solution that's been verified by members of the community that definitely know what they're talking about. So I'll leave a link to Kuro's work just for you to check that out, but those are definitely my suggestions. Next up, JP Brunau is looking to purchase one of the Retro Castle Mister kits, and they want to make sure they get the right one for their setup. They're specifically looking for something that could output component video, S-video, and composite video, depending on whatever display that they're using, but they also want to be able to just output HDMI when traveling, and they don't need one with dual RAM. So the only question I have for you is, will you ever need simultaneous dual output? Will you ever need to be outputting, let's say, 240p via S-video to your CRT and 1080p via HDMI to a capture card or a second display if you wanted to do that for whatever reason? If the answer is no, you're only going to be using one display at a time, I would actually get the same exact one that I showed in that video, which is the dual RAM compatible version. And it's not so much that the dual RAM is the important part, it's that it has the very high quality DAC built right in. It's still got the small form factor, it's still got everything that you need right there, powered by USB, the ports integrated in, all the stuff that I loved about it. And then you could just choose to use either the Saturn DIN for output or just pop out that ribbon cable and plug the HDMI cable in. And then I would just set up multiple Mr. INI files like I showed in the video as well, and have it default to whatever your most common use case would be. Let's just say S-Video. And then when you power on the Mr., you could either use a button combo, or if you get signal on the screen, you could just open up the menu and switch the INI files to match whatever signal output that you're doing, which that is going to be the case for absolutely every kit that offers these functionalities, including the new one that I just mentioned. So if that's the case, that would be a great kit for you. That would do everything that you need. And the only thing you might want to look into, HD retrovision cables will be absolutely perfect as long as you already own them. But if you don't already own those, then I would actually look into getting those very cheap Saturn to RCA cables, and you just leave the yellow one hanging and use RGB for component video. That would be a good solution. If you do need simultaneous dual output, you could definitely get the 2023 versions that have that stuff built in, or you could check out the Mr. add-ons with the 24-bit the 24-bit analog board that allows for simultaneous dual output. But that is a different form factor, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion. I know so many people that absolutely love those aluminum cases from Mr. add-ons that, triple stacked basically, and that's totally cool if that's your thing. I personally love the really small ones from Retro Castle. My opinion on this is either the case should look like a retro game console, not a science project, kind of like the M3 Mr. and some of the other projects that I know are coming up, or it should just be as small and compact as possible so I could tuck it out of the way and really only place it where I could hit the power buttons and stuff and plug stuff into USB. Just my opinions, though. These are both excellent choices. Any of the Retro Castle kits are great. The new 24-bit kit from Mr. Add-ons is also great. It's really just your preference and your total use case for all of this stuff. So I'll leave a link to that video again. JP already said that they watched it, but for anybody else who might be wondering what I'm rambling on about, it does get complicated because when I shot that video, there absolutely was no even mention of that 24-bit analog board that Sorg designed. And I think, I don't want to steal credit or anything, but I do think a lot of the hype around that Retro Castle case, maybe even the video, kind of pushed Sorg to relook at this thing and go, oh wow, we do have room for improvement, especially now with the N64 and the PlayStation 1 core. So if you watch that video and you're like, why did Bob not even mention this other thing? It's because it wasn't even in the design phase yet when that video launched. So I just wanted to put that out there. That wasn't like snubbing Sorg's design. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of his. It's just timing was off. And I think if Sorg released the design 6 months earlier, Ivory wouldn't have come out with that design. But once again, I don't know if Sorg would have had time or the motivation to do that without this one. So chicken and the egg type of scenario. But hopefully I could at least point you in the right direction for this stuff. But the good news is there's so many good choices that will allow you to do basically everything that you're asking and not require a ton of external dongles and adapters and all of that stuff. You basically just plug in your cables and select your Mr. INI file. A while back, Danny Funker wanted to talk about using a RetroTink 4K to digitize some Video8 tapes, and they were able to find a camcorder with S-Video output and have been using the Tink 4K to save them as 720p 5994 files and was having some issues. First, and I'm going to answer these out of order just because it's easier, YouTube seems to be butchering the quality of the videos when they upload them. So are there any tricks to avoid that from happening? Yeah, I would absolutely try at least one in 4K to see what happens. Because don't forget, not only is YouTube recompressing a 720p file, you're then stretching it to the native resolution of your panel, most likely going to be 4K. So you've saved it as a decent 720p file, but there's probably some compression on there. I don't think you mentioned saving it in lossless. So you have two things going on. Just the YouTube and your TV's bad scaling. When I say your, I mean all of our YouTube and TV's bad scaling of 720p compared to native content, as well as the compression added. So even if YouTube recompresses a 4K file, you're going to notice that less because it's still at the target TV resolution. So do just one transfer that way and see how it looks. And if it's a massive difference, which I think it might be, then you might want to look into just getting a bigger hard drive to save these on or something. Next, they're seeing a bunch of line artifacts on screen, those like slow rolling bars that go from top to bottom. I did not have this issue on Video8 VHS and even Betamax when I had that player and I was testing it with this. So I don't know what it could be, but one thing that Joe Redifer recently mentioned to me was that he was seeing the 3D comb filter actually add artifacts to S-video sources. So you might want to try turning that off, which in that profile that I posted, it was on by default. So, because the profile I posted was assuming that most people using that were going to be using composite video, which was a safe bet, I still think. But my suggestion would be do one more transfer. Still load up that same profile that I put in the Tink video, but turn off the 3D comb filter. And then, and if you could turn off the 2D as well, I don't think comb filtering is going to work at all with S-video because it's already separated from Y to C. So at the very least, turn off the 3D comb filtering, save it as the 4K file, basically the same exact profile pack that I posted, and see what happens. If the resolution's fixed, cool. If the rolling bar is fixed, there you go. Maybe that was the 3D comb filter and you could re-experiment with different resolutions. But if neither of them were, actually, just could you let us know how it went either way? I'd like to know if it worked, and if it didn't, let's still keep figuring this out. Next up, Tony Escobar wanted to follow up from the conversation from last week about trying to find a Saturn BNC cable that syncs on C-Sync to work through the Extron crosspoint. And just for a very quick short summary on this one, anybody that's using an Extron crosspoint matrix switch has to feed it C-Sync as sync. You can't use Luma or composite video. I've had a couple other people randomly say otherwise, but I've personally tested a bunch of them. Tony's tested it, a bunch of other people have tested it, and it always seems to only work syncing on C-Sync. So the problem is, how do you get the cables for this? And it turns out Tony actually found a custom-made retro access Saturn cable with C-Sync and Phoenix audio output, which is perfect. So now that'll work with the original Saturn. That'll work with the Mr. Add-on's 24-bit I/O board that doesn't have C-Sync on any pin other than C-Sync, which I talked about that last week. That is not a problem. That's totally fine because that eliminates the need for dip switches. But on the flip side, Tony also has a retro Castle Mister that does have the dip switches. So if you have a sync on Luma cable like this, you could just flip a dip and it'll work perfectly through the crosspoint. So really, really glad that all of this stuff was able to get worked out for you. Hopefully us talking about this on the Q&A would help other people in this exact same setup. And hopefully Rob will just start making the BNC cables for Saturn sync on C-Sync from here on, just so no one will have to worry about this in the future. But really glad everything worked out, Tony. Next up, Craig M. remembered me mentioning before that I would like to see controller manufacturers share their latency measurements. Absolutely, because a lot of these controllers really do have low latency, so they should want to brag about this stuff. I have no clue why they don't. But to continue, they just saw 8BitDo advertising their new Ultimate 2C controllers with 1000 Hz polling. Have they ever shared or marketed the polling rate for their controllers before? I don't think so, but this doesn't mean a lag measurement. It just means that it can poll at 1000 Hz. So if whatever device you're connecting it to can send that data out that quickly, it has the potential for lower latency on the USB side of things. Now, that means with a USB controller, if you plug all that in, yes, you could theoretically get lower latency than if it was the slower polling. But if it's a wireless controller, you still have the wireless conversion to worry about. So 1000 Hz polling doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be lower latency. It just means that it has the potential for. And I don't mean to sound negative, but my guess is they're using this as a marketing tool and not really understanding even where this goes hand in hand with what gamers want. Because if they did, they would have said our new 1000 Hz polling now runs at X milliseconds instead of Y milliseconds, giving you a faster speed in this scenario. So I'm just guessing here. I'm not, this is all speculation. I don't know anything about this. Maybe they have the best engineers in the world working on this now, and that's why they mentioned it. But it smells like marketing to me, if you know what I mean. So hopefully this means that they're going to start doing that. And I'm waiting on one last piece of the lag testing puzzle to arrive so I could start doing more videos on controller lag testing. Because having to build your own test board, even if it's as simple as it is, was a huge deterrent for a lot of people. So once a buddy of mine gets those boards on the market, I'm going to be doing a lot of streams, starting with that Brook adapter that I told them I was going to do months ago. I'm sorry, Brook, if you're listening. But I'm just going to start doing this all the time. And maybe by doing that and by having just a device people could buy and plug in and not have to look like a science project, even though it totally is, maybe that will push more companies. But it really is also up to all of you to do this as well. So maybe once I start doing these live streams again and I start putting the word out, why don't you retweet that and tag these controller companies and say, why aren't you doing this? And I would actually respectfully do the opposite of what many of you probably think I mean. I would take the ones that are very fast and tweet at, or whatever, at social media at the companies and say, hey, Bob just proved that your controller adapter, whatever, is very fast. Why wouldn't you post these results? Isn't this a good tool for you to use? I would spin it in a positive way rather than harp on the ones that are inevitably going to be slower, because I think that it's going to take consumers and positivity for these companies to realize how badly they're screwing up not posting their very fast latency numbers. The only thing I have heard is one company did mention they were a little bit nervous about that because that's not going to be everybody's results. But my opinion is, if you have the guts to say 1,000 hertz polling, not caring that some people aren't going to plug into 1,000 hertz compatible ports, you should also be able to, and I'm not picking on 8BitDo, I'm just using a stupid example here, but you should also be confident in saying, hey, in this test environment with everything that matches, here is the optimal speed that we found. If your system doesn't run the same, you're going to get slower numbers, but here's the best case scenario. I couldn't imagine a more fair thing to say about a product. And I'll try to keep spreading the word and hopefully the positivity about this. So good question, but let's keep plugging away at this. So hopefully companies can make it easier for all of us. And also the companies making the really good and fast controllers will now motivate the other ones to speed their systems up, so we all win. Next up, Rent Optional recently had an unfortunate power surge issue that tripped both their main breaker and their sub panel. And while all of their main electronics seemed to be fine, it did blow out a bunch of components in their refrigerator that cost almost $1,100 to repair. This seems to have been caused by a convenience store being built in the area, and when they were working on the power, they messed that up and it caused a surge, which seems to have damaged a bunch of other people's stuff in the neighborhood. So this is both a PSA that, be careful with stuff like this, because the power company could basically flip their middle finger up in the air and be like, it's not our problem, call the convenience store, which is exactly what happened to Rent. But also, do I recommend a whole house surge protector? So I do not have one of those. However, a good friend of mine does and absolutely swears by it. I believe he even has a full house UPS unit. So not only is it a surge protector, because if that happened, it may have blown out the UPS unit, which hopefully would be under some kind of warranty, but it wouldn't have gone past that. But on top of that, if you have quick brownouts, the power in your house should stay perfect, because any little dip is going to be picked up by the batteries in there. Now, unless you have something like a power wall with a solar system, that's not going to mean you could run your house on the UPS. But if the power goes off, then back on, supposedly nothing in your house should blip at all for little stuff like that. So it's both extreme surge protection as well as a minor little bit of battery backup. So once again, I do not have any experience with this whatsoever, but I trust my friend. He's a super nerd like us and wouldn't have invested that much money in something that wouldn't have at least been a help in a scenario like this. And I believe they were very expensive, but Rent has the absolute unfortunate perfect story about this. $1,100 to fix a fridge. I'm not sure if this was much more than that. And what if more than just the fridge blew out? So this is certainly something people should be considering. I have a dual breaker system in my house as well, and the main breaker is at capacity, and so is the sub breaker. And I'm looking to change some components around. My boiler probably should have died a couple of years ago. My AC unit should have died 10 years ago. I'm very lucky they're still running, but I can't really do a full upgrade on that until I upgrade the main breaker. And if I upgrade that, maybe I should just do it all at once. So unfortunately, something that should have been an easy install might be ridiculously expensive. So I can't afford to do it if that's the case. But if I could, if I won the lotto or something, I would absolutely be putting something like that in it. I don't know if I would go with a whole house surge protector or if I'm just going to go directly to solar, which is hard because while solar itself is not a scam, all the solar companies around me are. They all lie to you and tell you that your roof is fine and, oh yeah, buy these panels and you won't need to use power all year round. And they're all lies trying to get you to lease their panels. It's really gross and disgusting. And I threw one of the latest reps off my front porch the other day who came over. I was so mad they kept harassing me. But yeah, I know I'm getting a little off topic here, but the point is, if I have to spend a lot of, like if somehow we figure out a way to just remove one thing that I don't need and, put another thing in, I'll leave it all alone. But if I have to upgrade my main breaker, at least I want to go big with it because I don't ever want to worry about this again. I don't want to go 5 more years down the line and realize if I need to upgrade my refrigerator, now I got to do something else or something like that. So while I am not an expert and I don't have direct recommendations, I can tell you that I'm personally going to be doing something like that if I have to upgrade the main breaker. And I think it's at the very least worth looking into and getting some quotes. But also, as I'm doing, look at the total scenario. Are you going to be upgrading to solar soon? Are you going to be using a battery system with that or just direct solar into your house? If it's direct solar, definitely get a lot of surge protection just in case. If it's got the battery system, that's probably going to be your surge protection. But I'm speculating with some knowledge behind it. Just double and triple check this stuff. Don't just go and take my word for this one. But I think I'm at least pointing anybody who cares for this stuff in the right direction. Next up, a couple questions from Dustin Madison. First, for the PlayStation 3, what mod would be best currently if they wanted to play off of a hard drive, or is there an ODE available? So I would check out Mr. Mario's page. I'll leave a link to that YouTube channel and check out some of his guides for jailbreaking your PS3. And you could just load them right off the hard drive. I believe you could load them off the network too. There's tons of ways to soft mod the PS3 in order to do that. Now it has to be on a special firmware. It's a bit more complicated than that, but definitely check out his videos. I use them every time I need to reference something on the PS3. Also, they were wondering if I heard anything about the Fixel ODEs as of late. Unfortunately, I haven't heard back from Fixel in months now, and what I've heard, what I've heard through the grapevine is that he ran into basically every issue a person could run into manufacturing stuff, with manufacturing plants going out of business, issues with PCBs, and there's a lot of really, really upset people because I don't think he's even posted an email update or an update on the website or anything about this. And that's the badass consoles thing right there. Anybody remember all of that? Is people were way more upset about not knowing what the heck was going on than they, generally speaking, than they were about losing their money. And I know that's a bold statement. I'm going to get flamed like I always do for talking about that. But when you keep people updated, hey, here's what happened. Hey, I know this sounds like I'm lying, but here's a link to something that proves this is true. Here's what just happened to me. Here's what a lot of people will understand, especially people who have ever made anything, go, you know what? It sucks that my money is being tied up somewhere, but I get it. I've been there. Also, it's completely legitimate and okay if you're like, give me my money back. If you're not being able to figure this out, I don't have extra money to piss away like that. That's 100% fair. I'm just saying the lack of communication is the most upsetting thing about scenarios like this. Because while I don't have a couple $100 to just flush down the toilet, if I heard what was happening to other people, I will have a lot more sympathy than your average retro nerd because of how many times horrible things have happened to me over the years like this, where I had to scramble to get stuff out. And I've always tried my best at communication to alleviate this stuff. And there were a lot of other people, there was that one project where I don't want to call it out because I don't want to throw shade this person's way, but this was their second or third manufacturing run with this same contract manufacturer. The first 2 went perfect. Third, they just shut down and went out of business. And they even had a friend who lived in the area go there, and it was a ghost town. So everybody lost their money. But it was not the same level of anger and hatred as the other scenarios because he was completely transparent about what happened. So while, some people were livid they lost their money, most were like, wow, that's horrible. I'm sorry you had to deal with all of that. So my long rant was just basically a plea to Fixel to please update your customers. Maybe everything gets screwed up. Maybe you're back on track, but nobody really knows what's going on. So that's not how to handle things. I mean, this is why you hire other companies to do this for you. This is why you would take your design and go to Stone Age Gamer and say, hey, let's work together to get these manufactured. You deal with the customer side, I'll deal with the design side. A lot of people scoff like, oh, these companies take too much of a percentage. And then something like this happens and you're like, oh, that's what I'm paying for. So I'm not trying to dogpile on Fixel. A lot of people are upset. He's always been really nice to me when I've been able to get a hold of him. He seems like such a good dude. And it does seem legitimate. I don't get the impression he's sitting there going, well, haha, I took everybody's money. Like, I really think he's upset about this and trying to make it work, but he's just not being able to. So let's cross our fingers and hope at the very least we get some blog updates or something to figure out what's going on. And hopefully things could get straightened out and people could start getting their stuff. Next up, Super Hiku is looking into changing the thermal pads on their old consoles, and they were thinking about buying one of those large pads and cutting it into the correct sizes, but they'd like to know at least the pad's thickness needed for each console before buying. Do I know any source that documents the measurements needed for each? That's a great question, and I don't have any clue. That's a really good question, though. For any of the heat sinks that screw down, I just use Arctic Silver, and I also got that stuff that I think it's the 2-part liquid that cleans it off first so that you really get all the microscopic bits out of there, or as much as you can. Then you wait for it to dry, apply the new stuff, and screw it down, so that way you don't have to worry about anything else. But for stuff like thermal pads, like the N64, that's a really, really good question. And unfortunately, I got nothing. So can anybody in the comments add something to this? Does anybody work with chip design? Is there a standard? Is there something that you could measure with this? And by the way, this is wild speculation here, but is it a matter of if you go a tiny bit too thick, it's fine because you could squish it down, but not thick enough, you won't make the correct contact? Or do you really need precise? I don't know. That's an excellent, excellent question. And I've just been lucky that every time I've had kits that upgraded stuff, it came with its own thermal pad. So great question. And I'm sorry I don't have the answer to it, but hopefully we could get this because I think that's something that should be documented. Next up, Adam Ant was using the 240p test suite to test a Sega CD and found that the program RAM reads and writes but still fails the check. So they were looking for a reputable place to get those RAM chips to try to swap out to see if that fixes the issue. And they followed up a little while later saying they found them at Console 5. So I wanted to still talk through this question just because I bet you there's some other people out there that might be thinking, I got to get around to fixing that Sega CD someday, but I don't know where to get it. Apparently Console 5 does stock those, as well as so many other weird and crazy parts that you might not know that they have. So I'll leave a link to the store. The person who runs it, Luke's a very good person. I've talked to him on the podcast once, and I keep trying to get him back on, but my schedule is so crappy lately. I have a lot of people I wanted to talk to, but it's just getting harder and harder to find time. But hopefully we can get Luke back on, hang out, and talk about crazy stuff like Sega CD RAM chips. And if you need any of that, that is my go-to spot for capacitors or weird parts for consoles. That's where I go first, and then I'll look anywhere else after that. So thanks for bringing this up, Adam, and I'll point everybody to the right link. Well, that's it for this week. As always, ask any question you'd like wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. The way these services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, I just like scrolling through in real time and answering as if we were hanging out together like you saw today. Also, very often, like today, the questions are only on Patreon, as that's where the majority of people support, but they're all eligible for this. So it's not a Patreon thing. If you support in any way, by all means, feel free to ask whatever you want. I really enjoy doing these, and I think it's just a fun way to interact with all of you awesome people. So as always, thank you so much to everybody who supports in absolutely any way, including just sharing this stuff and talking about it. You are all who's keeping this stuff going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.